G'day brothers and sisters. I mentioned in the last episode that during the final week of Jesus' ministry, there was a dramatic acceleration of his criticism leveled against the religious teachers and the temple institution as a whole. Now this will all come to a head eventually at the trial of Jesus. But in the final week, Jesus will make this dramatic statement. He will say to the religious teachers and the people, "See your house," referring to the temple, "see your house is left to you desolate." The word desolate means dry and barren, this wasteland, and literally it means see that God will vacate his house. God's Spirit, which had dwelt in the Holy of Holies, would no longer dwell with the people of God, with the nation of Israel in the temple. Now, this had only happened on one other occasion in Israel's history from the time of Moses, and that was during the days of prophets like Ezekiel and Jeremiah, where the people had become so sinful after centuries of idol worship and rejecting God. He left the temple. The prophet Ezekiel has a vision of God leaving the temple, his spirit departing from the Holy of Holies, and then the temple was now ripe for judgment, which happened in 586 BC when King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians came in and destroyed the first temple, which was built by Solomon. In Jesus' day, the second temple had been built and it had survived for several centuries, and King Herod had made additions to this temple. Now Jesus was making this dramatic statement that, see, your house will be left to you desolate. God will no longer dwell inside the Holy of Holies, and now the temple institution is ripe for judgment. This sort of language is very familiar to us because as a body of Christ, we recognize that the Spirit of God no longer dwells in a building, but in a people group. The church, the body of Christ, is now the new temple, the temple of Christ, and the Spirit dwells within us. But to the first century Jewish audience, this was a spectacular and dramatic statement. Jesus was pronouncing judgment over the temple, and he was claiming that it was going to be destroyed. The events take place one day when Jesus is walking around the temple and around the compound. The temple compound was huge, brothers and sisters. It was about the size, if we included all of the surrounding buildings that made up the whole compound, it was about the size of 12 football fields. It was huge, and the disciples were marveling at this magnificent temple. It was an amazing temple. The temple in Jerusalem should have been considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, but the pagans had rejected it because the Jewish people were monotheists and not polytheists. But it was magnificent. It rivaled some of the greatest temples in the ancient world and even exceeded them. It was huge. Some of the stones that were used to construct it weighed tons. It was a magnificent, magnificent structure. And the disciples of Jesus are walking around the temple compound and they're pointing out to Jesus these magnificent stones, and they're saying, look at this lavish house that the people have built for their God. And Jesus drops this massive atomic bomb when he says, you see these magnificent stones? Do you see these stones which have been finely crafted and weigh tons and tons of material here? Do you see them? Within one generation, not a single stone will be left standing. And then the disciples privately come and ask him, what are you talking about? What is happening? This is incredible. How can you possibly say that the stones will not be standing? Now, this speech that Jesus gives has become known as the Olivet Discourse. It's a sermon Jesus gives on the Mount of Olives, and that's why it's known as the Olivet Discourse. It's one of the more controversial passages which Jesus speaks, and there are many radical and wild interpretations of this. There are people who try to take the things that Jesus prophesies in the Olivet Discourse and they try to say that's happening today, and they try to point to things that are happening in geopolitics today. But when we read Jesus' words, the clear verse that we need to pay attention to is verse 32. Look at what Jesus says in verse 32. He says, truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. So in other words, notice he's not saying this is something which is going to happen 2,000 years later during our time. No, he says this generation. A biblical generation was between 25 and 40 years. And we know that in 70 AD, so roughly 40 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus, this exactly happened. The temple was destroyed. The Romans came in, destroyed the temple, burnt it down, and it has never been rebuilt. So I want to stress, for those people that try to argue the things that Jesus talks about are things that are being fulfilled in our modern geopolitical context, I want to say to them that they are completely wrong. All of the events Jesus describes here in this passage are talking about what was going to happen in 70 AD, within that particular generation. Now, Jesus will go on to give around 5 signs that his disciples and the early Christians were to watch out for so that they knew that this was actually going to come about during their lifetime. The 5 signs he gives is he talks about false messiahs or false teachers. He says, watch out that you are not deceived, for many will come in my name claiming I am he. So he talks about false messiahs. The second sign he talks about is warfare. He says nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. The third sign he talks about are natural disasters. He says there will be great earthquakes, famines, and pestilence in various places. The third sign he talks about is persecution. He says, before all of this, they will seize you and persecute you. They will hand you over to the synagogues and put you in prison. The fifth and final sign he talks about is he says that Jerusalem will be surrounded by armies. Now, I want you to know, every single thing that Jesus predicts in the Olivet Discourse, every single thing he predicts happens. We can look at ancient sources, we can look at sources from the first century, not just biblical sources, but external sources, writers like Tacitus and Josephus, and we can pinpoint that everything Jesus said actually happened. If we take the false messiahs, we know that there were many false teachers and false religious teachers who rose up during this time claiming to be the Messiah. The book of Acts in chapter 5 refers to one of these, a man by the name of Theudas. Josephus, the Jewish historian, refers to a number of these guys. False messiahs happened. If you read the epistles of John, he talks about these antichrists, people who literally set themselves up in place of the true and the living Christ, Jesus the Messiah. So Jesus' words happened. He predicted that false teachers were going to come. He predicted that false messiahs were going to come, and it happened in the first century. The second sign he talks about is he says nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. Brothers and sisters, that happened. There were many wars which took place in this time. The historian Tacitus, the Roman historian, details some of these wars. It was a really chaotic geopolitical time after the period of Christ. Rome had a bunch of wars with foreign armies. There was threats even internally. In 69 AD, the year before this happened, there was an event called the Year of Four Caesars. There was toppling of key leaders. It was pandemonium. The geopolitical situation in Rome at this time was chaotic. The Roman historian Tacitus basically believed that the world was coming to an end. That is how chaotic the conditions were at this time. The third thing Jesus talks about is he talks about natural disasters. He talks about earthquakes. There were a couple of significant earthquakes which happened at this time. In 61 AD, in the region of Phrygia, which is in modern-day Turkey, the central part of modern-day Turkey. It was called Asia Minor during this period. There were a series of devastating earthquakes which took place in that region. Also in 62 AD in southern Italy, in the regions of Pompeii, there was a devastating earthquake. So this happened. Jesus refers to famines. The Bible in the book of Acts, Paul also mentions it in his letter to the Corinthian church. He talks about a significant famine which hits Jerusalem. We know that some of the zealots at this time burnt the grain supply. Jerusalem had enough grain to last for 5 years, but when they wanted to provoke the people to action against the Romans, they burnt the grain supply, and there was chaos and there was famine. People started resorting to all kinds of cannibalism. It was a terrible and devastating situation. Everything Jesus says comes to plan. He talks about there were going to be natural disasters, and that happened. The fourth sign he talks about is he says that they will seize you, they will persecute you. Again, we know that happened. The book of Acts records the persecution that befell some of the disciples. Stephen was executed. Paul will talk about some of his own experiences as he was persecuted. We also know that in 64 AD, the Emperor Nero, who was a bit of a madman, burnt most of the city of Rome. And because he wanted to remove guilt from his shoulders, he blamed the Christians, and many of them were tortured and many of them were executed. Jesus had predicted that his disciples were going to be persecuted. All of that happened. And finally, he talks about Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. And he says, when this happens, you will know that it's time for desolation is near. The technical phrase is the phrase abomination that causes desolation, or the abomination of desolation. Now I'm going to tack on a little bit at the end of this to actually go a bit deeper into what that phrase means, because a lot of people have questions about it. But all I want to say is that he talks about how prior to the destruction of the temple, he says, you will know that its destruction is near when Jerusalem is surrounded by armies. Now in 66 AD, there was a revolt. The revolt ended up being led by the Zealots. It was a result of something that happened in Caesarea, but a chain of events happened and it ended up being this revolt. And this led to what is known as the Roman-Jewish Wars between 66 AD and 70 AD. It begins in 66 and it ends in 70 AD with the Romans burning the Jewish temple and destroying it, as Jesus predicted. But in 66 AD, when the revolt first starts happening, the Romans send one of their generals. He is a general from Syria whose name was Gaius Sextus Gallus. And he came with an army and he surrounded Jerusalem. Now notice what Jesus says. He says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you will know that you need to get out. You need to flee to the mountains. Now ask yourself a question. If Jerusalem is surrounded by armies, how can the Christians get out? Well, this Roman general, Sextus Gallus, he only surrounds Jerusalem for a short period of time. For some reason, we don't really know why, he surrounds Jerusalem. He comes down without too many issues. He comes down to Jerusalem and he surrounds it. But eventually he leaves. We're not actually sure why he leaves. All we know is that he left. This prompted the Christians, the church historian Eusebius tells us, this prompted the Christians to actually see Jerusalem surrounded by armies and to see the army leave. This prompted them to take Jesus' words seriously, and they got out of the city. Whereas the people who hadn't believed Jesus, the Zealots, saw this. They saw the retreat of the Roman army as a sign that God was with us. So what did they do? They pursued the army. They pursued Sextus Gallus's army, and there was a battle in which they won. And this emboldened them to go out on a full revolt of the Roman Empire. And eventually the general Vespasian came down and he sent his son Titus to finish the job. They went with a scorched earth policy through the towns of Galilee, through Israel, through Judea, and eventually they arrived in the temple. Again, they put it under siege. The Zealots burnt the grain supply, so there was not enough food for the people. And what happened? The Roman army breached the walls of Jerusalem, came in and destroyed the temple in 70 AD, just as Jesus predicted. So I want you to know that Jesus' words here in the Olivet Discourse is not a prediction of something which is going to happen in our time. It is a prediction of something that happened in his time. He would later go on to talk about his second coming, and he would later go on to talk about that day or that hour being unknown. But in terms of the destruction of the temple, this was a reference to something which happened in 70 AD, which Jesus predicted, not something which is happening in our lifetimes. What tends to confuse people is the words that Jesus uses in verses 25 to 28. He says, there will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. On the earth, nation will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and the tossing of the sea. People will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now most people hear this language. They hear this language of the heavenly bodies being shaken. They hear things like Jesus talking about the sun being darkened and the stars are not giving their light. And they hear this idea of the Son of Man coming on the clouds, and they assume that these are futuristic events. You know, if we were to talk about the sun being darkened or the stars not giving their light, this is an apocalyptic cataclysmic event from a scientific point of view. If the sun stops shining, all life on earth ceases. So we hear these words of Jesus and we think, he's talking about some futuristic thing. But his audience would not have interpreted it that way. This sort of poetic language was the type of language used by the prophets in the Old Testament. It was a style of poetry which the prophets would speak, not to refer to some scientific cataclysm, but instead to refer to a great earthly judgment. If you read this language where it appears in the Old Testament in places like Joel and in places like Isaiah and Haggai chapter 2, it is talking about judgment within history. It's talking about a judgment which God brings upon an evil empire or on an evil institution, and he completely destroys it so that it will never be rebuilt again. When the language is used to refer to the Babylonian Empire, for instance, in the prophet Isaiah, it's referring to the destruction of Babylon, never to be rebuilded again as an empire. So here when Jesus uses this poetic language, it was a figure of speech, not to refer to literal things happening in the skies like we think, but instead to talk about dramatic events on this earth which shake the very fabric of our society. And that's how his ancient audience would have understood these prophetic words. So we shouldn't read these as literal scientific events. No, he's talking about the destruction of the temple so that it will never be rebuilt again. And I want to say this is important because there are people out there, crazy conspiracy theorists out there, who make all of these things and all of these crazy predictions online saying, there's going to be a third temple built in the Middle East and all of these sort of kooky sorts of fanciful ideas. No, the destruction Jesus is talking about is a permanent destruction. Never again will the temple in Jerusalem be rebuilt. It was destroyed. What is now in its place? Now it is the body of Christ. Jesus said, destroy this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days. So the new temple now is the people of God. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. We, the Apostle Peter will say, we are being built now into this new and great temple. So I wanted to spend some extra time pointing all of this information out to you because this passage is one of the most misunderstood passages in the whole Bible. Luke will soften some of the words of Jesus because he's writing for a Gentile audience, but I encourage you to read Mark's reproduction of the Olivet Discourse and also Matthew's reproduction, and you will see that what I'm saying makes perfect sense when you study the context of what happened after the resurrection of Jesus and in AD 70 when the Romans came in and destroyed the temple, because everything that Jesus said came to pass. God bless you, brothers and sisters, and we'll see you next episode. I promised, brothers and sisters, to tack on a little bit of an appendix to this episode talking about what the phrase abomination of desolation means. When we read Mark's reproduction of the Olivet Discourse, he will use the technical phrase. He'll say, when you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong, notice he says in parentheses, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now in Luke's gospel, Luke will summarize what the phrase means for his Gentile audience when he says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. But the technical phrase is this phrase, the abomination that causes desolation. Now I mentioned there are many people online who come up with all kinds of fanciful ideas as to what this phrase, abomination of desolation, means. And they think it refers to some end times antichrist who's going to come and lead people astray. Notice what Mark says. He says, let the reader understand. He includes this parenthesis note in the midst of Jesus' dialogue, in the midst of Jesus' speech. Why? He's saying to the reader, in that generation, to the first audience, you need to pay attention because these things are happening in your very midst. Jesus' words were happening now. It was a real thing for those believers. And he says, when you see the abomination of desolation. So what does this phrase mean? I mentioned earlier the phrase desolation means a dry, barren wasteland, like a desert. And it literally meant that the God who dwelt in the temple would no longer dwell in that temple. The phrase abomination refers to an egregious sin, a sin so egregious that God would no longer dwell in his temple. So now a sin, an abomination so egregious has taken place that God departs from his temple so that it can be destroyed and it can become desolate. I mentioned that this had only happened on one other occasion in Israel's history, and that was in the 6th century before the time of Christ. Now notice what the prophet Ezekiel says about those days in chapter 8. He said to me, "Son of man, do you see what they are doing? The utterly detestable or abominable things the Israelites are doing here, things that will drive me far from my sanctuary." So notice he says, do you see the grievous sins, the abominations that they are committing? So bad are these sins that I am going to depart my temple. God is holy. He cannot tolerate sin. He's going to depart his temple so that it will be destroyed. And what Jesus is saying when he borrows this phrase is he's saying the people of God's people, the nation of Israel, the people of Israel are committing such atrocious sins that God is once more, like he did in the Old Testament, once more he will depart his temple and it will be destroyed. Unlike the first destruction where the temple was rebuilt, this second destruction, the temple will never again be rebuilt. So what is this phrase, abomination of desolation? Well, it actually appears 3 times in the Old Testament, all in the book of Daniel. Once in chapter 9, once in chapter 11, and once in chapter 12. The references in chapter 11 and 12 refer to an event, unmistakably, there's no way around this. They refer to an event which happened in the 2nd century BC, before the time of Christ. There was a really fanatical and crazy king. He was a Syrian Greek king whose name was Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV. He had been embarrassed on the foreign policy scale, and in an act of just bloodshed and violence, he came into Jerusalem and he slaughtered a bunch of people, and he ended up sacrificing a pig on the altar of God and putting up a statue or an iconography to Zeus. So notice this egregious act, he slaughters a pig on the very altar which sacrifices were made to God. So this abomination, this act meant that for 3 years there were no sacrifices being offered in Jerusalem, in the temple. Now eventually the people revolted under the leadership of a man whose name was Judas Maccabees. It's where you've heard the phrase Maccabees, and this led to the revolt known as the Maccabean Revolt. Now eventually the temple would be cleansed and they would start to offer sacrifices once more. But the act that Antiochus Epiphanes had done by sacrificing a pig became known as an abomination that caused desolation. So Daniel predicted that this abominable act would happen so that for 3 years no sacrifices would happen. Now eventually when the people revolted against Antiochus and they were able to drive them out and they were able to cleanse the temple, this is what the event that became known as the temple, as the Feast of Dedication, or Hanukkah. So eventually they were able to cleanse the temple and start offering sacrifices again. But Jesus predicted that another event similar was going to happen, and this was going to be a new abomination that caused desolation. This is what Daniel was referring to in chapter 9. In chapter 9, Daniel gives us a bit of a timeline about another event which is going to happen, and that timeline equates to Jesus' words when he talks about the destruction of the temple. So Daniel's timeline and Jesus' timelines come together and are accurate. And Daniel talks about another abomination that causes desolation, another act which is going to be so egregious, a sin which is going to be so egregious in God's sight that he's going to destroy his temple. And this is what Jesus is talking about. He's saying to the people, you need to watch out because another egregious sin is going to be committed in the temple, and this is going to be the thing that is the catalyst for God eventually destroying his temple, which happened in 70 AD. Now the question is, what act actually happened in the lead up to the destruction of the temple, which Jesus is talking about here? What is the act that happens? What is this grievous sin, this abomination in God's sight? Well, there's a number of possibilities. It's not 100% clear. One possibility could be what happened about a decade or so before the temple was destroyed. The high priest Jonathan was actually assassinated. He was assassinated in the temple compound as a result of some political actions. He ended up being assassinated. This is one possible candidate. Another possible candidate could just be the general breakdown of society. In the temple at this time, in Jerusalem at this time, it was chaos. And there was so much sin, there was so much evil which was happening in this precinct. The historian Josephus will list some of the terrible evil which was happening in the precincts. Jerusalem really spiraled out of control. It was chaotic at this time, and people started practicing all kinds of immorality in the region of Jerusalem and in the temple precinct. These could be a general description of what Jesus was talking about when he said an abominable act, an abomination. A third possibility, and this is one that I have put forward, I've not come across anybody else who has put this forward. A third possibility is the idea that Jesus is referring to the sacrifices which were being offered in the temple during this period. Remember, the sacrifice of Jesus was the last and final sacrifice. It was the ultimate sacrifice, which meant anybody who rejected that sacrifice and tried to keep sacrificing animals, which the Jewish people obviously did because they didn't believe, most of them didn't believe in the Messiah, these sacrifices were never going to be accepted by God. Because why? He had made the ultimate sacrifice at Calvary. So any other sacrifice which happened in the temple after that period was by default an abomination to God because it was a rejection of the ultimate sacrifice, Jesus. So I've said quite possibly the abomination that causes a desolation could be the very fact that the people had rejected the Messiah, and in his place they had continued to offer sacrifices when God had made the ultimate sacrifice. Again, these things are debatable. We don't know for certain, but what we do know is that at this time there was this breakdown in society, and the sheer fact that the people of God had rejected the Messiah, this was an abomination. This was something that God could not tolerate. So what happened? The temple eventually was destroyed, never to be rebuilt again. And this is the event that Jesus predicted in the Olivet Discourse. So thank you, brothers and sisters. I know this was a very complicated discussion, but I hope you can read some of those passages in the Bible which talk about it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Gospels. And we will see you next time.